Good morning. I'd like to thank Minister Moses for attending this public meeting on National Housing Strategy bilateral agreement with the federal government. Before we start, I'd like to get our colleagues to introduce themselves, and starting on the left.
Good morning, Frederick Blake, MLA for Mackenzie Delta.
Morning, Tom Bollier, MLA for Tuneda-Willowday.
RJ Simpson, MLA, Hay River North.
Good morning, Danny McNeely, Satu.
Good morning, Michael Natalie, MLA for Ditchell.
Julie Green, Yellowknife Center. Good morning.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Shane Thompson, Henday. On my left is Megan Welsh, our research analyst. On our right is Michael Ball, our clerk of the committee. Again, welcome, Minister Moses. At this point in time, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to committee. I'm pleased to be here today to make a presentation on the National Housing Strategy with me and our bilateral agreement that I did promise committee during the business plans that we give details on that during the business planning session. With me today, I have Mr. Tom Williams, President and CEO of the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation on my immediate left. Mr. Revi Lau, Director of Policy and Planning in the back here. Mr. Jim Martin, Vice President, Finance and Infrastructure on my far left. Franklin Carpenter, Vice President, Programs and District Operations on my right. I also have my Acting Ministerial Special Advisor, Mr. Ben Fraser, joining us today. Colleagues, as you know, on November 15th, 2018, Canada and the Northwest Territories signed a 10-year bilateral agreement that initiates funding under the National Housing Strategy. This is the first time since the signing of the Social Housing Agreement in 1997 that we are set to receive long-term, stable funding. Under this agreement, the NWT will receive $87.7 million in housing investment from the federal government. When combined with the $51.7 million cost match from the GNWT, this investment totals approximately $140 million. And really appreciate the members that joined us on that day when we made that announcement in the Great Hall there. This agreement covers three main investment areas. The NWT will receive $43 million under the Canada Community Housing Initiative, or CCHI. This initiative is intended to protect, regenerate, and renew public housing by replacing funding scheduled for elimination by CMHC for the operations of the public housing program. The agreement for public housing O&M with CMHC will continue to see declines in federal O&M contributions. However, the CCHI will replace that lost funding over a 10-year period. All provinces and territories fought hard for Canada to recognize the critical importance of supporting existing public housing and have the lion's share of our National Housing Strategy allocation come under this program has been a real success. In consideration of the continued O&M federal funding declines, this initiative does not represent any net new money, but it stabilizes the operations of the public housing program for a period of 10 years, long enough for us to continue to explore options for its long-term sustainability. A further $8.7 million will be provided under the NWT Priorities Fund to address distinct housing priorities, including affordability, repair, and construction. This funding is similar in nature to the previous federal investments in affordable housing. As was previously announced, the National Housing Strategy also includes the $36 million under the Northern Housing Fund to address housing needs in Canada's north, and that's the NWT share. Funding under these three pots are earmarked to the following categories: public housing operations, home ownership repair programming, public housing maintenance, the Community Housing Support Initiative, demolitions, and environmental liabilities. Further, as we all know, the NWT's allocation under the Northern Housing Fund was not appropriate, and it had been a point of frustration for myself and the corporation. and we have taken every opportunity to drive that home with our federal counterparts. I'm happy to say that the work has paid off. We have negotiated better access to the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. We'll get into a little bit of detail during the presentation. This fund is application-based and aims to support and development mixed income, mixed tenure, mixed use affordable housing that is energy efficient, accessible, and socially inclusive. Through our work, we managed to negotiate a dedicated carve-off of $60 million for the Northwest Territories. No other province or territory will receive a carve-off with the exception of Yukon. Should the $60 million be fully utilized, the NWT will be able to apply for further funds at the national level, but will have to compete with all other jurisdictions. Further, an increase in the maximum federal contribution was negotiated of up to 75% of project costs. This is an increase from the former level of 40%, which remains the maximum that southern jurisdictions can access. So it is a big win for the Northwest Territories in that area. I anticipate that there will be extensive interest from community partners, NGOs, and development corporations in accessing the co-investment fund. NWT Housing Corporation will be working with CMHC on promotional material to clarify the application process. The co-investment fund could be used to develop new senior housing, renovation to exist social housing, new community-based housing projects, new shelters, shelter renovations, new transitional housing projects, and many other affordable and housing and social housing projects. The funding for the NWT will not stop at what was agreed to in the bilateral agreement. An additional $9.6 million is being negotiated under a proposed Canada Housing Benefit, which is scheduled to launch in 2020-2021. This program is currently under co-design between Canada and the Northwest Territories, but would be administered by the NWT. This has been a long and arduous process that we have been working on for more than the last 2 years. I know that regular MLAs and standing committee have been very vocal advocates in the need for more federal funding for housing, and have relied on and appreciate the solidarity, and I took our cause to Ottawa, and our staff has done a great job in working with their counterparts. I hope we can all agree that this funding agreement is a major win for our constituents and for the sustainability of housing in the Northwest Territories. This does conclude my opening remarks, Mr. Chair. I do look forward to answering any questions that committee may have, and I do believe we have a presentation that our President CEO, Mr. Tom Williams, will be walking committee through. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Ms. Green.
Do you have copies of those remarks to share with the committee?
Yeah, we can. Dan, you want to make some? Sure. Yeah. We can make some copies.
Thank you.
To committee. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In this presentation, I'll provide a short history on the development of the National Housing Strategy, provide some explanation on the various funding pots, and give some indication as to the next steps. So moving to slide 2, the federal government initiated discussions with the provinces and territories on the National Housing Strategy over 2 years ago. In conjunction with the 2 other territories, the NWT pressed for the housing needs of the North to be a key pillar of the National Housing Strategy, which the federal government and the rest of the jurisdictions agreed to. Moving to slide 3. A multilateral framework was developed between the federal government and all provincial provinces and territories on how we would work together, which included broad principles for the National Housing Strategy. Last month, the NWT signed an agreement with Canada around the 3 components of the National Housing Strategy: the Northern Housing Fund, Canada Community Housing Initiative, and the Provincial Territorial Priority Fund. Slide 4. I will now get into more details of what each of these funds entails. Slide 5. The Northern Housing Fund. The Northern Housing Fund, totaling $300 million over 10 years for the three territories was a North Pacific pot of funding that the three territories pressed Canada to create. The funding can be used for repairs and renovations or new construction. Unlike other federal pots under the National Housing Strategy, it does not require cost matching. Canada created the fund. However, the respected allocation of the funding created disagreement from both the NWT and the Yukon. Subsequent changes to other federal fund, the National Co-Investment Fund was balanced the funding between the three territories to more historical norms and more accurately reflects the historical need. The term of the fund is 10 years from 2018-19 to 2027-28. Slide 6. The Canada Community Housing Initiative. One of the major negotiating areas for the PTs was around the declining O&M funding for public housing. There are approximately 500,000 social housing units across the country, and a steadily decreasing support from the federal government for these units was creating a housing crisis for vulnerable families that depend on this affordable housing support. This is especially important in the NWT, where nearly 1 in 6 households reside in public housing. By 2038, all federal funding for public housing operational maintenance is currently scheduled to be eliminated. The federal government's interim solution was to preserve public housing delivery by providing funding approximately equal to the amounts that will continue to decline under the existing social housing agreement. Although O&M contributions will continue to decline for the period up to 2027-28, those declines will be provided back as contributions to provinces and territories to help strengthen and make more suitable, sustainable the public housing sector. These contributions can also be used for public housing operational and maintenance. The NWT's allocation under this pod is $43 million from 2019-20 to 2027-28. This fund requires a cost match from the territorial government. The GNWT will be able to use existing expenditures on public housing as a cost match. Moving to slide 7. Funding for provincial and territorial housing priorities. This fund provides flexible funding to address specific jurisdictional housing issues. The fund totals $8.7 million for the NWT from 2019-20 to 2026-27 and requires a cost match. The amounts under this fund are approximately equal to fund the investment in affordable housing, which expires in 2019. This previous funding was used for home ownership repairs. Slide 8. Other funding areas. There are a number of other components of the National Housing Strategy that are not covered off under the agreement that was signed last month. Reasons for the exclusion of those elements include the requirement for more design work and negotiations, unilaterally delivered by Canada or areas of funding under other federal ministries. The funding areas include the Canada Housing Benefit, the National Co-Investment Fund, Reaching Home, the federal government's new homelessness strategy, and seed funding for project startups. Slide 9, Canada Housing Benefit. The federal government has been in a co-design process in each of the province and territories on the Canada Housing Benefit, which the federal government envisions to be affordability support provided directly to families and individuals. NWT's share would be $9.6 million from 2020-21 to 2027-28, and this would require a cost match. In preliminary discussions around the design of the program, the NWT has communicated to Canada that the benefit needs to be relevant in small communities where there are few or no rental markets. Slide 10, Co-Investment Fund. This program is which is being delivered by the federal government through an application-based process. The affordable housing proponents a grant or loan or both for the development of new affordable housing or the repair and renewal of existing affordable housing. Projects could qualify for contributions up to 40% of their project costs. On the initial launch of the program, no allocations were made by jurisdictions, but rather the funding was allocated on a first-come, first-served basis on the merits of the project proposal. We felt this would severely hamper the ability of NWT-based proponents and lobbied the specific stream for the NWT. The federal government, partly as a means to balance differences in funding under the previously mentioned Northern Housing Fund, agreed to carve off $60 million of co-investment fund for the NWT. Additionally, instead of the maximum contribution of being 40%, it was raised to 75% for the 3 northern territories. There appear to be many uses of this fund, from the development of new housing, construction of new shelters, and the repair and renovation of various types of housing infrastructure. Some of the initial projects that are now being explored for possible funding under the co-investment fund include the construction of a new Hay River Family Support Center, the renovation of Yellowknife Women's Society building on Franklin to provide more independent housing, and an Avon Seniors project, a Fort Good Hope homeless project in partnership with Habitat for Humanity. The program runs from 2018-19 to 2027-28. Slide 11. Reaching Home, the National Homeless Strategy. The Homeless Partnering Strategy is a 5-year initiative that expires on March 30th, 2019. Federal government is launching a replacement to the Homelessness Partnering Strategy. Reaching Home is its new homelessness strategy. The federal government began its evaluation of the program in 2018, and feedback from the NWT was clear that the NWT required more funding and that the initiative needed to be more accessible to other communities, not just Yellowknife. Although the federal government has not released many details of the new strategy yet, we do know that amount of money being made available to the 3 northern territories is $43 million, or approximately 3 times what was the 3 territories previously received. Additionally, the federal government created a northern stream under the initiative, but the program elements for that are not known yet. Slide 11, seed funding. Proponents requiring support for planning and logistics for their projects can access up to $150,000 in non-repayable contributions and up to $350,000 in loans from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. These funds could be used for feasibility studies, market reports, design drawings, and other planning documents. It will be important to dovetail this support with the National Co-Investment Fund. Slide 12. The NWT share of the National Housing Strategy. Including all pots of money, the NWT's allocation totals approximately $160 million to 2027-28. Slide 14, allocation. The table shows the allocation of the 3 pots under the agreement. $87.7 million signed November 15th, as well as the NWT cost match of $51.7 million. And the total investment, including NWT cost match, is $139.4 million. Slide 15. This table demonstrates the new funding investment per year. It represents funding that's sunsetting, such as the investment in affordable housing, which amounted to $1.84 million per year, and the declining operational maintenance funding for public housing. Slide 16, the allocation. In terms of planned investments, a large proportion of the funding, especially amounts under the Canada Community Housing Initiative, are planned to be utilized to stabilize and strengthen the public housing system, as it will continue to suffer declines in federal O&M funding. These include $3.6 million for public housing operational maintenance, $13.6 million for public housing maintenance. $8 million is identified for demolitions and environmental liabilities. $16.5 million is earmarked for home ownership repair programming. $11 million will be allocated to the Community Housing Support Initiative, which has led to successful community partnerships towards the development of new affordable housing. Example of this is the Salt River First Nation. $2 million is identified for apprenticeship funding as well as policy support. Slide 17. Indigenous housing strategy. Many questions remain on how the federal government is rolling out its Indigenous housing strategy. There seems to have been some progress on support for the Nunavut Regional Corporation. However, for other Indigenous groups in the NWT, the federal government's initial stance is that there will not be any direct funding to any other groups. The engagement plan with the federal government on this issue has been multi-focused, from discussions at the officials level to raising this between ministers and by the Premier. Some current messaging by Canada seems to suggest they are getting the message. To further coordinate efforts, the Minister will be convening an Indigenous Housing Summit in the new year. This summit will not allow Indigenous leaders allow Indigenous leaders to send a message loud and clear to Canada about the Indigenous housing need in the NWT, but also provide a venue for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation to present some of the opportunities for housing investment, such as the co-investment fund. Slide 18, next steps. In terms of the next steps, the NWT Housing Corporation will be developing, as part of the requirement under the agreement, a 3-year action plan on how it intends to meet outcomes and priorities under the National Housing Strategy. Officials are continuing their work around the Canada Housing Benefit, with a focus from the NWT on making the fund available and meaningful to all NWT communities, and not just those with rental markets. The NWT Housing Corporation will be working with CMHC on promoting the co-investment fund, as well as looking at getting approvals for partners projects that are currently in the mix. We anticipate getting details on the new National Homeless Strategy soon. Lastly, an Indigenous Housing Summit will be convened to discuss opportunities for federal engagement as well as investment opportunities. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Questions for the Minister? Ms. Green.
Thank you. I have a number of questions, so it may turn out that I need to go back on the list after this. Thank you for your presentation and for the detail that you've provided around this agreement. I can see that it represents additional investments in different kinds of housing. However, we would like to see the agreement itself. When can you make that available?
Thank you, Ms.
Thank
Green. Minister Moses.
We can provide the agreement itself, and we'll get our staff to email it to committee. Now, I know that maybe to all members. Yeah, we'll send it to all members. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Ms. Green.
Thank you for that commitment. My next question has to do with core housing need. That's the document that most of us use as a sort of measuring stick for what needs to be done. So have you got analysis to share with us about how these investments address core housing need as they were defined in the last community housing survey? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And there's a lot of things that we're actually doing within the NWT Housing Corporation. As the bilateral agreement was just signed recently, we're not sure how it's going to affect core housing need, obviously, because there's a significant amount of money that we did get from the federal governments. And one area that we're going to be working with the communities on is these community housing plans. And we've already have some staff in Wati right now working with the leadership there. And instead of us telling the communities what they need, we want to hear from the communities and say, what is your needs? What are your priorities? And working with them to develop these community housing plans. Obviously, we're going to be looking at our capital plan as well. We do have our condition rating systems in terms of what needs to be completed, looking at our inventory, and I think having our capital plan coincide with the community housing plans that the communities develop, we should be addressing more of the needs in the communities. And with the three-year action plan that I did mention, it's going to give us an opportunity to see the results, monitor and evaluate what's happening in the communities, and then after 3 years, we develop another three-year action plan, and this is going to go on throughout the 10-year agreement that we have with the federal government. Maybe a little bit more detail. I'll ask Mr. Williams if you'd like to add anything. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, certainly with this new investment, I think we'll see a reduction of core need across the territories. We'll be able to inform the Assembly on and the members on our progress going to date, because we will have a 3-year action plan, as the Minister mentioned. So on a regular basis, we'll be able to show progress that we're making on reducing core need. It's one of the big, when the National Housing Strategy was developed by the federal government jointly with the province and territories, that was one of the whole premises, is to look at results. It's a results-based strategy showing a reduction of core need across Canada. So something that we'll be able to present back to the members. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Ms. Green.
Thank you. One of the things that I still don't understand about government is why they make commitments of funding without having outcomes in mind, specific outcomes. So I'll give you an example of this. Affordability is a huge problem in Yellowknife. There's something like 800 or 900 households that reported affordability problems in 2014 survey. And what you told us today is that affordability is going to be allocated $9.6 million over 10 years. So I haven't done the math on this, but I'm going to say that pot's not going to spread very far among 800 households. And so why is it that amount? Why isn't it another amount where we can follow the math of this is how many houses have affordability issues, and this is the size of the pot, and so we're trying to reduce affordability issues by 10% a year for 10 years, or whatever the target is. But what I don't see is a match between what the need is as we understood it in most recently 2014 and what the response is in this housing plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as we mentioned, we do have a 3-year action plan that we're working on right now. And we can definitely take those suggestions into consideration as we're going through developing those action plans. All jurisdictions are doing that right now, and I think that's something that we'll have to continue to stay on top of federal government in terms of getting any kind of funding to address the affordability. In my last meetings and letters that I have given to Minister Duclos, I have asked him to come up to the north to see what our challenges are. He's yet to take me up on that offer, and just to let him know what we're facing in the Northwest Territories and the realities of living in the north and in our rural and remote communities. But we are working on our action plan. We will take that into consideration.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Moses. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm interested in the numbers on slide number 15. On slide number 15, it indicates that the new funding from the federal government is going to be $87 million, and our funding from GNWT would be $51 million, as it indicated in a previous slide. However, there seems to be some adjustments that reduce the federal net funding, reduces to a net new funding from the federal government. Could I have the Minister explain slide number 15 in a little more detail, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, this slide is intended to demonstrate the residual funding that the Housing Corporation will have to work with after a couple of the existing funding pots are taken into consideration that are declining. So the first funding pot that the Housing Corporation has currently in 18-19 is an extension investment in affordable housing agreement. And under that current agreement, the Housing Corporation is receiving $1.84 million per year, and that will expire in 2019-20. So we'll be utilizing this funding, obviously, to offset that decline going forward, because we have that invested in priority home ownership programming. The second pot that's declining that we have to take into consideration is the base funding or the operations funding that the federal government provides the Housing Corp for to operate public housing and our unilateral organizations, and that is also factored into the mix here. So when you net out those two declining funds with the new funding coming in under the National Housing Strategy, you end up with the net amount per year as presented in the slide. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, that's not clear to me. The federal government is committing to $87.7 million over this period of time. Then from that, does this slide indicate that those two declining funds, one existing IAH funding and the existing declining CMHC funding, will cease to decline during this time period, and that the net funding would be the stopping of the declining on those two funds plus the $34 million? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Mr. Martin.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The intent of this slide is to show the net CMHC funding that the Housing Corporation will be receiving. So we have new money coming in of $87 million, and then we have the total here of $16 million approximately, and $36 million declining over that same period of time. You net the two. That is the net amount of CMHC funding that the Housing Corporation will have to invest in its programming and operations over the life of the NHS agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Mr. Bolio.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, so in order to continue to maintain the level of funding for those two programs, that we would use a portion, or just over $53 million of the new funding from the CMHC to make up for the two declining funds. In reality, we would just receive the 3.4 on average at $3.4 million a year with under this agreement. That's correct. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Bolio. Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is correct. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been waiting months, maybe years, to ask this question. The housing affordability is an issue everywhere, and in Hay River, part of the problem is that we simply don't have enough market rental units. It's not just social housing. People are priced out of the market because there's so few rental units that people can't find a place affordable enough. This is a supply and demand issue, and I've brought this up many times in camera and in the House, and the last time I brought this up in the House, I laid out the problems in Hay River. Access to land was one of them, and that's being dealt with. The issue that we have now is access to capital so developers can actually build some rental units. Hay River, if you talk to most lenders, Hay River is considered remote and not a good place for investment, and so it's difficult for developers to access capital in order to build rental units. And that's a barrier that's keeping the price of rental units up. And so when I brought this up in the House, I brought it to the Minister. I was told that once this bilateral deal is signed, this money, there may be an opportunity that the developers could access funds through this as loans, not handouts, as loans, in order to develop properties in Hay River. And I see, according to the slideshow, there's about 7 pots of money. And so does one of those pots allow developers to apply for loans in order to develop rental units in the north? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I know our staff has been working with a lot of leadership across the Northwest Territories ever since we did make a couple statements in the last session with our partnerships with Clerk, our partnerships with the Inuvialuit. That's sparked some really good discussions on how can we work with other communities to do some really good, investments and partnerships to address housing needs across the Northwest Territories. This one in particular, co-investment fund that we just announced on the 15th, and we're giving a little bit of information on that today, is one area that we'd be willing to look at. And also working with our private industry and as I mentioned earlier, the community plans that we're hoping communities start developing. I do know that our president CEO has been doing a lot of work and speaking with people in the community of Hay River in terms of how do we address the concerns that the member has brought up. So through you, Mr. Chair, I'll go to my president CEO, just give a little bit update on work to progress and where we can look at those kind of funds and which pot we can take it from. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As the Minister alluded to, certainly the co-investment fund is probably the pot that we would look at for private investors. They could get both low interest loans that they could access the capital they need to construct housing in their community. Going around the territories, like as the Minister also said, we're doing community housing plans. And I've been traveling around. I've been to a number of communities across the territories, and it gives us, now that we have the announcements being made on the funding, it makes my job a lot easier to talk about, not only to talk about the community housing plans, but talk about capital that communities could access to work with us in partnership for developing housing, meeting the housing needs for each community. So there's a lot of interest out there. We will be doing a series of engagements to make sure that the private sector and the Indigenous governments know how to access funds under the co-investment fund. It's a relatively new. It's only been a month since we signed the agreement, and now it's our time to get the messaging out there so people know how to access it. One of the benefits under accessing the co-investment fund is CMHC recently increased their seed money, their seed program. It used to be $25,000. It's now up to $50,000. So you could private industry or any proponent could access that funding. Actually, even the GNWT could access it as well. Because eventually, under the co-investment fund, I think one of the things that we always looked at is we'll eventually run out of partners in the NWT. We're not like the big jurisdictions like Ontario where they have tons of REITs and big private industry partners. But eventually we can run out, and one of our big questions was, well, if we do run out of partners with NGOs and private sector, as a government, can we access the fund? And they said, and the answer was yes. So I think this $60 million pot's going to be made to good use in the NWT to meeting the housing needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Mr. Moses.
Yeah. And just further to that, Mr. Chair, Mr. Williams mentioned the seed funding. It did have a significant increase, and I encourage all members to let their leadership or any of their partners that they're working with in their communities know what the seed funding is, and we can give you the contacts to the CMHC coordinator for the NWT, and I know since we've been meeting with a lot of leadership, we've been really pushing the seed funding, and it works on developing a proposal on using like technical designs, engineering, architecture, and it could be a start for a proposal to the co-investment fund. So using federal dollars to access our GNWT dollars. So, allows our dollar to go a little bit further.
Thank you, Mr. Moses. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. So just to be clear, looking at the slideshow here, it looks like the co-investment fund requires partnerships from municipalities, NGOs, Indigenous governments, etc. I'm talking about having private individuals or private companies build homes that they then rent, or build apartments that they then rent, which will bring the price of rentals down across the community. Can private individuals access this fund without a partner, such as an NGO or an Indigenous government or a municipality? Just to be clear. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Moses.
Yeah, just to confirm, yes.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you very much. Now, the next question is, how do they do that? And I know the deputy or the president mentioned engagement sessions. So when are these engagement sessions going to happen? Because as the witnesses know, Hay River is looking to develop a new subdivision, and it'd be the sooner the better, essentially. So when can I tell my constituents that they can begin to at least learn how to access these funds? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Moses.
Short answer is you don't even have to wait for the engagement sessions. Have whoever you're talking to contact our office and or contact myself, and we'll make sure that we get in touch with our staff and start having those discussions and giving them information on the seed funding to start it up. I mean, you don't have to wait. I mean, we've been getting people calling the office already after meetings that we've had with leadership from the SAT2, from the Beaufort Delta. We just did a little meeting in Aklavik, and we're having people calling us already. We're in Lutzel Cave, Wati, Yellowknife's Dene have been talking to us. So we've had some NGOs call us already and looking at how can they access this funding. So yeah, if you have somebody in mind, any of the MLAs, have them contact us, and we'll get that ball rolling and start talking and getting things off the ground here.
Let me talk about engagement.
Sure.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Some of the upcoming engagement sessions that we have is NWTAC has asked both us and CMHC to participate, set up a booth at NWTAC so we could meet with community member leadership. So that's in February, I believe. We're meeting a lot with community governments right now and Indigenous governments on our community housing plan. So that's an engagement that we're doing. So far, we've been to Wati, Delaney, we've been to Paulatuck, Klavik, Fort Liard. So we're getting out there, and our plan is to hit all 33 communities to talk about community housing plans, but also talking about, we have the opportunity, like I said, it makes my job easier to talk about what money's available to access, to implement these community housing plans. So we get a good opportunity to engage on the co-investment fund and the seed money availability. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and congratulations to the department for this new initiative and signing the agreement and so on. And as my colleague had mentioned, there's several pots of money out there, and if we look at the table core need assessment a couple of springs ago, that'll give the basis of demand. And I'm glad that you're going to all communities and developing a community plan. From that plan, I would say, would be the starting point of the core need assessment. So I look forward to our engagement session in the SAT2. Now that our winter road is going to be open on the 20th, I understand, so get ready. Also part of the, I want to put out a couple of points for your community plan. Number one is land tenure, so it should be in there, and the off-highway communities on the winter road systems. Some of these off-road communities only are accessible twice a year, either by the barge or by the winter road. In the case of Delaney and Cove Lake and places like Wati or Wigweti and those places, if you miss the winter road, you wait another whole year. And it could be quite a social problem issue on the clients that are falling through the cracks because of the seasonal access. So I just emphasize the need for those 2 points in your community visits, and I look forward to the summit, and I look forward to visiting the other communities aside from Delaney. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we do understand that. Even before we're getting into the community housing plans, with our capital plan, we did a what we started doing was buying materials a year before, getting in the community so that we can do the build the next year. I just want to let the member know that we have met with Yamoga Lands Corporation. We have met with Delaney. I believe Mr. Williams is going to be meeting again with leadership from Delaney to look at some possible projects moving forward and how we can work together. And like I said, we're open to meeting with all leadership, NGOs, and as I mentioned in my opening comments, stakeholders that have that I guess you could say have skin in the game or have an interest, and if you guys can just get them the information and contact either myself or Mr. Williams, we'll get that ball rolling. But we have engaged in the SATU already, and actually leadership has engaged us, and we've had meetings already. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Moses. Mr. McNeely.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll use an example, and maybe you can contribute on what options are available in the community of Delaney. Having knowledge of their community ventures, there's a two-building structure, two duplexes, and I do believe they ran into some social or some financial problems, whatever. And the buildings itself, I'm going to take a guess at 80% complete, and apparently there's no money to finish them off. How can your programs help with those two particular duplexes there in Delaney?
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Minister Moses.
One of the programs that we have within the NWT Housing Corporation is the Community Housing Support Initiative. All we need is a proposal from the group, and we can start working with them. That's another great program that we've been promoting throughout the territories and when we having our meetings. So I'd say that'd be the best option. As I mentioned, Mr. Williams will be meeting with some leadership today from Delaney, and maybe we can bring that up and see what we can do moving forward there. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Moses.
No, thank you for that response.
Ms. Green.
Thank you. One thing that I'm having trouble understanding is the Indigenous housing strategy, potential funding, and the public bilateral agreement that we're here to talk about today. So if, for example, the Clecho are successful in negotiating some money from the federal government, what impact would that have on the way the Housing Corporation spends in that community? Do they then become sort of independent in meeting their housing needs, or how do those two things work together? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. During last session, I made a minister's statement on our partnership with the Indian Valley Regional Corporation. They were successful in negotiating some of that funding. One thing that they did was they looked at our capital plan, and they used our capital plan to use that funding to help us meet the housing needs in the ISR region, Indian Valley Settlement region. And then I'll get Tom to go into more detail, but it was a partnership that we signed with them. We just signed a memorandum of agreement with them as well. Any other communities that might be successful in getting that funding, and we've actually been reaching out to mostly the self-government groups to see if they have gotten funding and how we can work together. In terms of capacity building, training, IRC, the good thing about that was they hired a lot of their beneficiaries. They had a lot of training, and they helped us with our capital plan. So it was a really good story at the end of the day. And any Indigenous groups that might get that funding, we'll definitely reach out to them and try to work with them. One other thing is that, as Tom has mentioned, that we're going to be looking at this Indigenous Housing Summit and bring all of our Indigenous leaders together so we have one common voice going to the federal government saying that we were left out of this Indigenous housing funding, and yet we have a population of about 52% Indigenous in the Northwest Territories, and we need to have that addressed. As I mentioned earlier, we invited Minister Duclos to come up and see what our challenges are, see what is needed, and yet we're still need to hear back on a response from him, but maybe I'll ask Tom to get into a little bit more detail on our agreements with the Inuvialuit and how it's benefited us. And we've actually reached out to the Tlicho and to Delaney to see if they've had any funding or negotiating anything and how we can work together. But maybe I'll, through you, Mr. Chair, go to my president to get in a little bit more detail.
Thank you, Mr. Moses. Minister Moses, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like, certainly the allocation of the Indigenous Housing Fund is a sore point with us as a government. You know, with only one group getting the funding, direct funded, the Inuvialuit, through their work with ITK, it's, you know, the rest of the territory got shut out of the money. So we're going to continue our lobbying efforts. I think having this Indigenous Housing Summit, it'll bring all the players together and it'll make one voice for the North to get the additional funding. How it works is, you know, we have the arrangement with in case of the Inuvialuit, they agreed to work with us in partnership. So we signed a memorandum of agreement of how it's going to flow. They basically are following our capital plan. They have their own design considerations in some cases where they are using their own designs and having input into it. They do the delivery. We participate in inspections. We participate in. They make sure that that we're meeting energy standards, and they turn it over to us at the end of the day for $1. And it's part. They didn't want to take on the capital costs of running these units. They're not ready to draw down jurisdiction for under self-government, but they will be in the future, and they will draw down jurisdiction. So what the tack that they're taking is building capacity. They're building capacity of their people, putting people to work, and delivering our product. So what it does, it's really supplements our capital plan and helps accelerate delivery of our meeting housing needs. So we look forward to working with the other groups. You know, if we could get it's incremental money the way we see it, getting the direct flow of money from the feds to an Indigenous government. And, you know, we have a model that works well with the Inuvialuit, and it's certainly something we want to present to the other groups as they get their funding. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Ms. Green.
Thank you. I appreciate that response. Obviously, our housing needs are huge, so if Indigenous groups can obtain their own agreements with the federal government, that's a good thing. I guess the thing that I don't fully understand is around increasing the number of public housing units. So there's a waiting list, obviously, in Yellowknife, and I'm going to say in every community of the NWT, and many of the people on the waiting list are not candidates for buying homes because they are seniors or because they're on income assistance or they're in other ways low income. And so you know, historically, the Housing Corporation has said that they won't add any additional public housing units. But it sounds like there's sort of a backdoor through the Indigenous housing money to add more units. Is that fair to say? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and definitely we do have a lease own program, home ownership program that we're starting up as you guys know from business plans, as well as private investment that we can work with private industry. But yeah, you're right. I think one thing that we've been promoting when we've been meeting with the Indigenous governments is, you know, some of them have their own land already. So if we can go into a co-investment agreement with them, or they work on the work using one of our other programs, that we'd be able to address some of these needs. So I think that's something that we got to promote more. And as we're engaging and having meetings with the Indigenous governments, that's something that we'll have discussions about. And actually, some Indigenous governments have already reached out to us and talked about those options. Yeah. So definitely. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Ms. Green.
Okay, thank you. So that wasn't exactly on point with my question. So what I'm understanding is that although the Housing Corporation has capped the number of units that are public housing units, there are units being added through the Indigenous housing agreements, and so there is a greater O&M coming forward because you will have the additional units. Is that correct? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As the units are added into the housing market, like that's what would be added. We can't really add to our public housing unit because of our tie to O&M with CMHC, the declining CMHC fund. So we're pretty much stuck at 2,400 units. But adding more units in the community and putting more houses on the ground, that'll be through co-investment fund. I think that'll be our biggest thing, and getting private sector involvement, putting more houses actually on the ground for people to stay in. That's how we're going to increase the numbers of housing and reduce core need in the community level. We're very fortunate we got this huge pot of money that we could help alleviate housing concerns. But the way it's set up, it's a private partnership with private industry, including Indigenous governments, and they're going to be part of the housing solution. And non-government organizations as well.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, it appears as though this is not a whole lot of money for a lot of work. It seems like what we mostly managed to do was allow the NWT Housing Corporation to retain the declining fund from CMHC. That seems to be the majority of the strategy. We started with $3.6 million a year from the federal government, and we indicated that's not enough. We ended up with $3.4 million a year, if you look at slide 15, because the majority of the money that we're getting in, plus some of the initial Northern Housing Strategy money, is going to be invested into the declining fund. So to me, it seems like it's not a whole lot. And then as far as anything new, as the President just indicated, it looks like it's going to be in the market. So for people who could afford the market. One of the things I had hoped for was that we would repair houses and that we would build home ownership units. People need to have their houses repaired. It seems like everybody's stuck in some sort of issue with land lease, or they're limited to the amount of money they can get. They're limited, of course, by income, and I can understand that there is a core need income threshold. But because of the issue with the current claims negotiations, that means that it's difficult for individuals to really determine what the status of their land is and apply for any sort of substantial repair. For my riding, I represent 4 Aboriginal communities, and the biggest need is for those houses to be repaired. The houses are going to a point where they're almost at a state where they're beyond economical repair, and if we don't do anything, they would have to be replaced. The people can't afford to replace their homes. The Housing Corporation is not in a position to build new homes. So I'd like to ask the Minister if they would look at a different strategy, or when the home ownership or the market housing or the housing development plans at the community level are in place, if they would really look at what they can do with the houses that currently exist, or what they can do really in the area of home ownership. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Minister Moses.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate the comments. I mean, we have visited and chatted with leadership from the members' constituents. Land claims obviously is a big concern when it comes to land tenure and the work moving forward there. And we did have a really good meeting in Lutzelke, and we had those kind of discussions. There is a home ownership program in terms of $16.5 million through this program. On top of when the member did mention that it doesn't seem there's a lot of money, but we did get that $60 million carve off for the co-investment fund. I think it's going to go a long way and have a big impact At the announcement when we did that on the 15th, I said it's going to be a game changer. Working in partnerships with communities to address that, plus the funding that the IRC got over their term. I think it's in the area of 75 million, and they're going to be working with us and having a good partnership to address those needs as well. But we went in, we did say to leadership, let's just say, bring up Lutz O'Kay, for instance, we go in and we'd present all the programs that Housing Corporation does and do an engagement session with the community members and leadership and let them know what they're able to access. Obviously, there are other concerns there that we see across the territory, and that is arrears and being able to access some of the programs, because some people are in such high arrears that it's unable to access some of those applications. But I do hear what the member is saying, and the concerns that he brought up, his leadership has brought up as well, and we are working with them. And like I said, Lutz O'Kay, for instance, we're going to go in and do a housing programs session with the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Mr. Bullia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the co-investment fund is $60 million. That's correct. But what I'm saying is that, okay, so we're looking at, we have some terms here that are not clear to me. Okay, affordable housing. I'm not clear what that is. Community housing, I'm not clear what that is either. So what I'm saying is a simple program which allows individuals to apply for repairs. Instead of having a fancy name like co-investment, we just want somebody to get their house repaired. And that seems almost impossible, whether it's inside the area of claims or not. It almost seems impossible. Unfortunately, if we're going to sit back and wait for the claims to be settled in a KHO and DECHO, we're going to wait a long time. It seems like when we got into this government initially, we were told that would be we'd have an AIP in 1 year on one negotiations and another one in 2 years, and this is now the 1 year one is now looming for May of next year. But if that date is exceeded, then we're still in the same situation through the entire government, this government, and people are still not able to access home ownership programs to repair their houses. That's what I'm seeing on the ground. Like I'm not talking about being an expert in all the programs and everything. What I am an expert in is asking for help for individuals that want their houses repaired, and that's what I do a lot. And it seems like it's not happening. So here's what I think we should do. The slide 15. All we've done is we've taken this money and we've backfilled the money that's being diminished. The Housing Corporation should actually have a strategy on the diminishing fund. And one strategy would be to sell public housing units to people that can afford it. There's a lot of people that want to buy the public housing units they're in, and we make it almost impossible to do because we have the public housing units in one of my communities. As an example, there's a house that is in horrible shape. It was appraised at $51,000. So the guy's saying, well, the exact same house next door was written off, and then it was resold on as a public, I forget what it's called, public tender process, and for $5,000. But the house he's still in, the minute he steps out and moves away, it's going to drop to $5,000. But as long as he's sitting in it, he's going to pay $51,000. I'm wondering why the Housing Corporation would not reduce the amount of public housing they have and sell it to people that are in public housing that can afford it, instead of backfilling the money and keeping people dependent on public housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bully. Minister Moses.
Yeah, I'll go to Franklin here shortly, but we do have that lease-to-own program that we're working on. We also got the home ownership program that we're going to be doing this year, where we're looking at creating home ownership units and at least one in the 5 districts across the Northwest Territories. So we are working on it slowly. I mean, but a little bit more detail, I'll ask Franklin to speak to it.
Thank you, Mr. Moses. Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to give some context around our selling of our public housing assets, we do actively promote the sale of our detached units, especially to long-term tenants. In all communities outside of the major centers, we have our own way of determining their value, which is really a depreciation method, and most of them that we're selling, because they're older units, do not have a lot of value to them. However, there's some cases where tenants want to purchase their home, but they may have arrears or something, so we have to capture that back as part of the sale. In terms of the MLA's comments about programming and repair programming, it's safe to say for us, I guess, that we've really stripped them down over the years to the bare bones in terms of trying to make them the most accessible as possible. We've removed a barrier, or what we perceived as a barrier, in terms of the income thresholds. We removed a middle one now, so that we would eliminate pretty much eliminated all the requirements for the co-pay portion. And what that's resulted in is we've had I would say a significant increase in people participating in our repair programs. We've just to give you some information, we've maxed out our budget twice so far this year. So we're just concentrating now to get people through the winter with our emergency repair program. But again, some context around programming that makes it difficult, I guess, in times, is that if we're going to put significant investment in a home, that we do when we get into our major repair program, is we do ask for minimum principles, I guess, from our end, and that's home insurance. Home insurance is a good thing. Land tenure. People should have land tenure. That's their property. And those three key areas. The third one is arrears, and we've been flexible on that as well. And that if people enter into repayment plans with us, we will consider them for repairs. But sometimes we get stuck with those things. Just in closing, though, I can tell you that we do a lot of work with MLA Bolio on trying to achieve successful outcomes, and we do really want. I guess we want to say we appreciate that. I think he may debate with me on this. I think we have the same objective in mind to fix those homes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter. Mr. Beaulieu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I don't question the sincerity of the NWT Housing Corporation. I often question the shell game that CMHC plays with all housing corporations right across the entire country. And, we are set up a lot different than some other jurisdictions where, as a public housing unit gets paid off, it almost becomes a market housing unit very quickly. It's easy for the CMHC to play in the field where employment rates are high. There's lots of jobs and so on, but we're in a different situation here. So I really don't have anything else to offer, but just to say that I'm not trying to criticize the housing corporation, but rather trying to maybe just the way CMHC plays the game, I think, is something that the corporation is probably more aware than I am, but that's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. More of a comment? Do you wish to respond to the comment, Mr. Moses?
No, I know that staff, during our bilateral agreements and in meetings with CMHC, we always bring up the concerns of the Northwest Territories and the uniqueness of the Northwest Territories. We bring it up with the ministers when we have meetings with them. So they know, and it's just having to continue to push that message home. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Bolio touched on this a bit, but under slide 5, I like the flexible criteria there. As you know, in the 80s, we had a number of people that took advantage of the HAP House program that was in place at the time. But since then, a lot of the houses have a lifespan, and we're getting close to the end of that lifespan. And I have a number of constituents that live in those houses that need renovations, but yet they don't fit the criteria. And with the cost of living, especially up in my riding, it's very challenging to, save, say, 30,000, 40,000 for renovations. So I'm hoping that there's some flexibility in working with these individuals, some kind of payment plan, to help them to get renovations, whether it's changing the roof or, at the time most homes were built with shingle roofs, so, metal roofing, things like this, just to bring their house back up to standards. And, I know it's been a huge issue over the years, and I'm hoping that this would help those individuals. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Minister Moses.
Yeah, I think Mr. Carpenter gave a good response earlier in terms of this, but working with individuals, getting them on a payment plan so that they can access these programs is first and foremost when it comes to arrears, but also looking at the land tenure as well as insurance for the house. I mean, and I think our LHOs do a good job in trying to work with these individuals, but appreciate the comments.
Thank you, Mr. Moses. Anything further, Mr. Blake?
Yes, the other thing is, I know Miss Green brought this up, but added stock. We always talk about the stock of housing, and in communities such as my riding, we have up to a 3-year waiting list for some individuals, and it's just a challenge that we usually have to wait till someone moves out of the community, or some unit comes available before these people are able to get a unit. I know we have a new initiative that just came up in Aklavik at the transition housing, but it's always important to get these new units or added stock to communities, because there's a huge demand for housing, and we're always looking for new units in our communities, multiplex units that would help that would go a long way. I know in the last government we were working towards that, is trying to get more multi-unit complexes in our communities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Minister Moses.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And there's a number of programs that we're doing, the lease to own. We're doing home ownerships. We'll be working with NGOs as well as private investors. And that if we get public housing unit stocks where people own them, then it'll open up for more inventory that we can look into. I think a big thing that's going to help us in terms of setting priorities is these community housing plans and working with the communities to address what is needed. And as we do this co-investment fund and work with our partners, I think we'll start having an impact on the core housing needs and addressing some of the needs in our communities.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The other thing, Mr. Simpson brought this up, but there's also a need for more market housing. Right now we have, a number of units, and I'll just use Fort McPherson as an example. We do have some units that are there, but it's kind of on hold for either teachers or RCMP. It's challenging because we have young families that want to get into market housing, but they're being told that those units are kind of on hold. So there's a demand out there, especially we have mines hiring more in our small communities, and, it's very challenging for, our residents, constituents that want to better their lives and have their own homes. So I'd really like to see more market housing in those communities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, certainly we'd like to see more market units in these communities too. And there is, don't want to just keep on harping on our new programs. The co-investment fund will help entice private industry to get involved to build more market homes. I know we used to have the rural and remote program. I think it was $25,000 per door. We had some success, but it was limited success. I think the amount of capital that's available under the co-investment fund will certainly entice our development corps across the territory or private investors to get more involved to build market units. We've seen some success, and even in Fort Simpson, where a private developer is bringing units into the community to deal with the market. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. If we could go to slide 5 in the presentation. Have we had any kind of a better explanation as to why Nunavut got $240 million out of the $300 million for the Northern Housing Fund, and we only got 36? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And shortly after I took on the housing portfolio, went down to Toronto for an FTP meeting. We were able to schedule a meeting with Minister Duclos, and we sat across from him in the meeting and straight out asked him, how did you come up with this formula? We got shortchanged by a lot. We got 12% of that funding. Yukon only got 8%, and 80% went to Nunavut. Him and his staff can give us an explanation. I think part of the continued negotiations, we continue to send them letters about how can we offset this, and I think this co-investment fund was part of that to try to rectify the situation. We're going to continue to put pressure on the minister in terms of the Indigenous Housing Fund, but to be honest, he didn't have an explanation for us. I know Tom's been working on that file quite a bit. I don't know if Tom wants to add anything further.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Mr. Williams.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, certainly trying to get a clear description on how they did the allocation. They did make an attempt, but it wasn't very clear for us. So that's why we stepped up our lobbying efforts. It's tied to core need, but it costs of doing delivery, but we have the same cost as Nunavut. So, we couldn't understand how they did it. Neither could the Yukon. But it's, I guess, the fact that we have options, eligibility for other pots, like hopefully we get more money under the Indigenous housing, because they said theirs is included in the 240 for their Indigenous housing piece, where we got to Nunavut got a direct flow of funding. So we'll continue to lobby the federal government and get clarity on this. And, this is one of the reasons why we're doing the Indigenous Housing Summit. We want to bring all the players together and have one voice to go into Ottawa, and maybe it'll force a decision made. We're hearing some indications they may look at something for off reserve, which will include us in the territory here. So that'll be something in the new budget maybe. So we're just have to step up our lobby efforts, because we still don't have a clear understanding how they did the allocation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks for that. I guess I'll offer a couple of comments. I want to compliment the Housing Corp, because the Towards Level Ground report that you guys did put together took a while and a lot of pressure from the regular MLAs. I think that starts to make the business case a lot more clearly for our housing needs, and I would encourage the corporation to update that at least on an annual basis, because that's your business case that you need to take to Ottawa. But I think what I would also encourage is that the messaging that goes to Ottawa has to include housing as a priority. When, look, you know what I'm going to say next. So when our ministers appear before Senate committees talking about Arctic priorities and housing isn't even mentioned, that does not send the right kind of messages. It cannot always be about roads to resources and big infrastructure projects. Housing has to be much more of a priority for this government in terms of our federal engagement, period. So I'll leave it at that. You guys know what the message has to be, and you just have to make sure that gets into the messaging from your cabinet colleagues, especially the Premier and the Minister of Infrastructure. I have a question, Mr. Chair. I'm trying to understand a little bit more about the rationale for this cap of 2,400 units that the Housing Corp wants to maintain as a stock. Can someone explain that to me? Because 24, if we keep that cap in place, there's just no way we can ever meet all of our housing needs. So I understand the co-investment fund might be an opportunity to increase housing that's available for folks in our communities, but what is the rationale for this 2,400 unit cap? And how do we get around it, and how do we start to add government-owned public housing units to meet our own housing needs? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as was mentioned, the Housing Corp, in terms of our business planning, does take into consideration the major planning variable being the declining CMHC funding. We are continuing and striving to maintain and preserve the same level of public housing unit offerings that we have in the communities. But we are up against that major challenge of that funding continuing to decline. We're pleased that this agreement provided us with some relief for the next 9 years that we'll be able to offset with new funding that decline, to give us additional time to come up with additional mitigation measures so that we can continue to preserve the level of public housing that we have. And there was some good suggestions already made here today, and we alluded to those as well in some of the earlier presentations, and that is lease to own, for example. That's a very good initiative. We're also looking at incremental revenue opportunities for the Housing Corporation. We're continuing to work with the RCMP, for example, in terms of their delivery that we've been working with them for some time on, and it's about ready to be finalized to move ahead with that deal. That will provide additional revenues that we can put directly into sustaining our public housing stock. We're also looking at other measures as well in the overall plan, such as market housing units. When we introduce additional market housing units, there is a revenue component associated with that. And as long as we can cover the operating costs associated with those units, we are able to put that incremental as well towards sustaining public housing stock. So we certainly have it front and center. We do identify clearly as a risk for the corporation. And we'll continue to implement these mitigation measures and others as we bring forward annual plans in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Mr. O'Reilly.
I don't have any further, thanks.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate what some of the other MLAs have said, that home ownership is important. I was speaking with an elder from up north, and he's been around for decades, and he's seen a lot, and we were talking about jobs. Even when there's jobs around, it's sometimes hard to get people to work. And he said it goes to a lack of pride. And he talked about people used to have their own homes, and they would say, it's not much, but it's mine. And then the Housing Corporation showed up and said, you can't live in that. That's substandard. Here, come live here, $2 a month. And then they get them into that system. And he said that's taken away people's pride. And so I just want to tag on to what MLA Bolio and Blake said, that we need to get more people into home ownership and give them that pride back. I just wanted some clarification. I was looking at the co-investment fund and the CMHC seed fund, and they both talk about affordability. And it says affordability as determined by the municipality, province, or territory, or as accepted under other CMHC programs. And so, we're talking about private businesses accessing loans to build market rental units in communities. what would be considered affordability? What metric do they have to, what standard do they have to meet?
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Simpson. Mr. Carpenter.
We can ask her.
Could try. Thank you, Mr. Chair. What CMHC uses to determine their affordability, or the term affordable housing, is the 30%, that people aren't spending more than 30% on their shelter. And generally what they use is they'll check what the median market rent is in the community. And if your rents on your new project are there or below that, that would be considered an affordable project. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. So just as long as it's median rent or below, so as long as you're not building extravagant units, that's all that's required. Okay, well, thank you for that answer. I appreciate it. Nothing further, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Ms. Green.
Thank you for giving me another turn. Some time ago, I requested statistics for home ownership programs from your agency, and what I got is that over a 10-year period, the HELP program assisted 283 households across the NWT to transition to home ownership, and the PATH program was taken up by 91 families to provide, as I understand it, down payments to build homes. Those are very modest numbers of uptake out of the, I don't know, 10,000 households or whatever the number is in the NWT. So what I'm wondering is, what is the Housing Corporation's plan to make home ownership more attractive to residents? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just give some history on the HELP program. The HELP program was initially designed that people would earn equity during the first 2 years or so, and then they would access other programming such as PATH and become homeowners. What happened, though, is those units, very few converted to home ownership. We didn't intend that program to develop to where we still, there, in a sense, the tenants or clients are paying for the unit. They're operating it. They're paying us a modest rent each month, and it's very successful for us. We have a inventory, including our market units, of about 330 that we operate every year. So what we're going to do with that is, like you pointed out, the stats on homeownership are not where we want them to be. They're low, particularly the down payment program. And the easy answer for the down payment program is people have a tough time accessing financing, particularly in rural and remote communities. So we're building our new homeownership programs. We anticipate a big blitz this spring, which is going to be a combination of we're testing out a new home. We're getting back into what was brought up before about the old HAP program. It was very successful. We're going to try a new design out that we want to see families move into. We put a bedroom downstairs. Hopefully they'll take care of a senior or somebody disabled. Hopefully they all move out from public housing into this building to free up some units. And the second phase of it is what MLA Brolio brought up, is sale of public housing units. So, like I said, a big blitz where we want to see a lease component and we want to see an equity component. So the job ahead of us is we got to convince those people in our HELP program and in these new programs to eventually take ownership. Part of the reason is the answer that we get a lot of times is they like the security that we provide through, we repair those units. A lot of communities don't have access to trades. It's just our housing organizations that provide that service. So what we're going to do too in the new year is we can't see our homeownership programs having success unless there's access to that service. So we're going to make our maintenance service available to private homeowners, whether it's repairs and materials. in communities where they're non-existent. So so far it's been welcomed. A lot of the communities are looking forward to that. That seems to be the biggest fear in converting. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter. Ms. Green.
Thank you for that response. I think another reason that there is an uptake is because I don't have the numbers on this, but I think a lot of people in public housing are on income assistance or they're seniors, and so they don't have the income to own homes. So do you have any information of those who are in public housing, how many of them actually have the income to own homes? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we do. In our public housing program, it's heavily computer-driven. We have designed and built our own computer system where we track everything about running public housing and the tenants, and we track incomes. So what we're doing now is we're analyzing, particularly we want to get home ownership into smaller communities, is we're analyzing our data on who's making consistent income that can afford units, and we have access to that data. And like I said, this new design it's a 4-bedroom home. We want to get people in there that are working and with extended families that may be working to make the home successful, that they can operate it as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter. Ms. Green.
Thank you. Would it be possible for you to share that analysis with the committee, not at the individual level, but at the community level? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and yes, we can make that commitment to share it at the community level. Yeah.
Okay. Does anybody else have any other questions?
I just had 2 more.
Okay. Because I just giving you a hard time. Ms. Green.
Yeah, thank you. Just 2 more here. I know that you are doing special analysis of the needs of seniors and their housing, and so I'm wondering how these new pots of money will apply to an investment in seniors' housing where it's needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As the member knows, we are doing a seniors study. We're going to wait till that study comes out, and then, as we mentioned, and on numerous occasions here, working with our NGOs to address some of the possibly, like, let's say Avens or the Mary Murphy building that we're working on. When that senior study comes out, and I've mentioned in the House too that I think our 2 biggest municipalities that we're going to need to address seniors' needs is going to be here in Yellowknife and Hay River. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Ms. Green.
Yeah, we're looking forward to seeing the results, but what I'm wondering is what money there will be to invest in the results when they are available. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister Moses.
Yeah, thank you. And before we got into the meeting this morning, we were chatting in my office, and I was mentioning that all signs point to a co-investment fund, and that new carve-out is really, like I said, is going to be a game changer for a lot of different groups, our Indigenous organizations, our NGOs, our communities. So, co-investment fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Green.
Yeah, thank you for that. I thought that might be the case, but I wanted to confirm that. And just one last point is about Habitat for Humanity. They're very active in Yellowknife, as you know. Would they be eligible to apply under the co-investment fund? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister Moses.
Application.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and we've met with Habitat for Humanity. They know the programs that we're running, and I believe they are doing a national application. Yeah, and like I said, once we're done with this co-investment fund, as a government, we can still put applications in once we've exhausted the 60 million carve-out. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Minister Moses?
Thank you very much for your answers.
Okay, I do have a few. On slide 11, it talks about negotiating a specific northern stream of 43 million for 3 territories. What's the allocation per territory? Minister Moses?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And during the presentation, Mr. Williams did mention that it's $43 million, and at this point, we don't know. We're still waiting to hear what that allocation is. But once we do get that number, we will share it with, definitely share it with members. Yeah.
Okay, so we don't know what it is, it's just there. And we're still stuck on this 240 million that's going to Nunavut. So I'm just trying to understand, so what they've said to you guys is that some of the information that was part of the Indigenous housing. Was that part of their answer to why they got the 240 million, or no? Maybe I misheard that. Could you please clarify that?
I'll get Tom to speak to it a little bit more, but I think it was after the fact. I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of Nunavut, but I think they were thinking that their fund was just Northern Housing Strategy funding, and then after the fact, I'm not sure what the federal government then told to them, but I don't want to speak for them, and I don't think it's fair for me to say how they negotiated their deals or anything, but I just know that when we spoke with Minister Duclos and his staff, that it wasn't very clear on how they negotiate that money, but and I don't think it's fair to put my president in a situation to speak on behalf of his counterparts in Nunavut as well, but yeah.
Okay, thank you, Minister. I didn't want to put anybody in the spot. I just heard that, and I just trying to understand that, because I know ITK gives money to the IRC, but AFN and the Métis Nation of Canada isn't. And so I guess my question to you guys, I know you guys are lobbying Ottawa, and I've written a letter to the MP. I've talked to our regional DFN and talked to them about sending letters and that as well. But have you guys talked to AFN and the Métis Nation of Canada and asked them why they're not looking at the Northwest Territories and allocating funds from that way? Thank you, Minister Moses.
Initially, we've reached out to our Indigenous partners after we heard that IRC got their funding. We wanted to see if anybody else was lobbying their Indigenous organizations, NIOs, National Indigenous Organizations. And we had varied responses. As for us, maybe I'll go to Tom for a little bit more detail. To my knowledge, I haven't. We're just reaching out to our local leaders, and that's where we came up with the idea of putting this Indigenous Housing Summit together, and for one, promote our programs, but also have one collective voice to go to Ottawa and say, we've some of our groups have missed out on this funding, and we want to help work on rectifying the situation. But personally, I have not reached out to AFN or the Métis Nation, but maybe I'll go to my president, CEO, to go into any further detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we haven't reached out to the national organizations, but we did meet with the new elected president or chief of the Dene Nation, and he agreed that lobbying has to happen, and he was prepared to help us lobby with the AFN. We did the Métis. I had a discussion with the president of the NWT Métis Nation, and they agreed that they're doing stuff internally. They're willing to collaborate with us on a lobbying effort because, again, they reached out to their own organization, and they just said they were going south of the Red River communities, what they were looking at. So there wasn't a clear answer for the Métis, but Mr. Bailey did agree to work with us in partnership to step up our lobbying efforts to get money flowing north. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. And Minister Moses.
Yeah, just really quickly as well. In the meetings that we have been having with our Indigenous organizations, we've been getting good uptake from the leaders saying that it's a good idea. to lobby the federal government, but also on the summit itself and getting that information out to leadership across the territory.
Well, thank you, Minister Moses and President Williams. To me, that's what we need to be doing. I honestly think we need to do as much lobbying as we can to the federal and the partners out there that are having an impact. I just have two other questions. One is, when we talk about the IRC, and we're talking about their money coming into the Housing Corp, or they're building the houses and they're selling to you for $1. So I'm assuming these are public housing units, and we're going to have to look after them. So is these units on top of the 2,400 housing, or is this in part of it? Thank you. Minister Moses?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned, the IRC is following our capital plan. So they're replacements, and they're also doing some demolition work for us, but they are just replacements.
So we're staying in with
Yeah,
the
staying
200?
within
Okay.
our limit. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So the last question is about the co-investment fund. So we're talking, well, maybe be a couple more, but right now it's one. When we talk about $60 million, I'm assuming that's over a 8 or 9 or 10-year period. And so we're looking at, is it breaked out per year, or is it just $60 million? And if it's first come, first serve, and once it's done, then we have to go back to the federal government? Or is it just is it broke down yearly? Thank you, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The way this fund is allocated is $60 million, I believe, over 9 years. And it is, we could carry over money. We don't have to, there may be some years early intake where we might spend $10 million in 1 year, for example. Next year we may not have any, but we could carry on. The fund is continuous. So until it's all spent. So we have 9 years to spend $60 million. And if we do, there's also opportunities at the same time, or even after, if we did spend all the money, is to go to the national fund. So there's opportunities, but it's at a lesser rate. It's only at 40% of federal investment opposed to 75. So it's our best interest to spend the $60 million. So we get the 75-cent dollars. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Williams, and thank the minister for showing up here today. That's all my questions. If there's any other questions from committee. Oh, Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. A little more on the co-investment fund. The president just stated that the 60 million has 75-cent federal dollars and 25-cent territorial dollars. What if someone is accessing a repayable loan through that, like I spoke of earlier, private developer? Does that come out of the 60 million and deplete our 75-cent federal dollars, or can we take that maybe from the federal pot of money? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Martin.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, it'd probably be best to get that repeated if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Just to make sure I.
Okay.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. So the co-investment fund, the feds will, it's $60 million, and the feds will chip in up to 75% of a project. But if a private developer is just applying for a straight loan because it's difficult to get from other institutions because of that we live in the north, will that loan go against that $60 million, or is it just understood that it will be repaid, so it won't make a dent in that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Martin.
The Housing Corporation has yet to move forward with an application of that nature, but we know that we have $60 million, and that $60 million, our initial understanding is that that would be for essentially contribution dollars, and the loans would be supplemental. But we have to confirm that, to be honest. I don't have the exact answer on that today, but that would be the expectation.
We get that information.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Thank you. Minister Moses?
Yeah, just for the record, we could look into that kind of scenario and get the information, get it back to the member.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, and as the minister recommended I do at the beginning of the meeting, I'm sending off an email to some private developers who are interested in this. And so other people will be asking this question. Well, they might not care where that money comes from, but I think it would be good if we can keep those 75-cent dollars and take these loans out of another pot of money, or whatever the case may be. I just want to hold on to those 75-cent dollars. So thank you for that offer. Nothing further, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. I do have one other question. So when we talk about this 75 or $60 million, is that including our share, or is that the federal government plus?
So it's, federal dollars, and then our share would put it up to 80. Yeah. And just to confirm again, that we can still go back to the national application process, and I think that's what Habitat for Humanity is doing. So they're doing the national application, and then leaves more dollars for other groups in the territory to access our funding.
Thank you, Minister Moses. I guess the big thing is we should be saying there's $80 million in this co-fund, because it's $60 million, when we say 75-cent dollars, I automatically went, and that's 45 million, right? So I'm very happy and excited that it's $80 million, so $80 million over 9 years, that's actually a good investment. So at this point in time, if I don't see any other questions from committee, I will turn the floor over to Minister Moses for closing comments.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee. A lot of good questions, a lot of good suggestions. We've taken them all down. As I mentioned, we are developing this action plan to coincide with the agreement on the National Housing Strategy. We will keep members apprised of what's going on, and I encourage all members to reach out to your NGOs, reach out to your leadership, have them contact myself or contact the staff to like I said, get the ball rolling and start addressing some of our housing needs in the communities. So really appreciate it, and thanks for the questions this morning.
You mentioned that we have the tech.
Oh, yeah, I did have that. Sorry. And we do have a technical briefing, I believe.
Tomorrow.
Revi and Tom will be doing a technical briefing tomorrow afternoon, so that'll get more information out to the media. So.
Can we get a copy of that technical briefing after it's done, so we can share it with our constituents and that?
Yeah, we could do that, yeah.
I don't want to do it before, but just afterward.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Minister Moses, and the corporation for showing up. I know usually it's only about an hour and 20 minutes, but we did almost 2 hours, so I appreciate the time. Yeah.
It is huge for all of us.
Yeah, so I thank you very much for your time.
Yeah. And I appreciate the members that came out to the announcement. We really appreciate the support.
Okay, thank you. Committee will just let the minister, and I guess we're closing it off now. And